At one point, Suge Knight was one of the most powerful, often downright dangerous, figures in hip-hop. His control over Death Row Records gave him a lot of influence in the sector, but there was one individual he could never subdue or intimidate: 50 Cent. 50 dominated the hip-hop scene, and certain circumstances made sure that he was never intimidated at Knight. But additionally, there was a genuine chance that the former Death Row CEO was afraid enough to resign, according to Knight's representative. By that time, Knight had already lived a fairly colorful life. He met 50 Cent Mary, and Hugh Knight Jr. was born in Compton and was nicknamed Sugar Bear as a child, which influenced his stage moniker. Knight had a bright future. He played football but never became a professional. Instead, he became a concert producer. With his huge physique, he was ideal for serving as a security guard for famous people. Client list, which also included singer-songwriter Bobby Brown. It is at this point that I want to pause and highlight the fact that Suge basically made a living by intimidating and controlling people. Robert Van Winkle, better known as Vanilla Ice, was the first artist to face Knight's fury, and he was joined by producers, artists, and even the founders of other labels. Suge Knight started his own music publishing company a few years after he quit football to pursue music. The following year, in 1990, Vanilla Ice released Ice Ice Baby, which you might have heard of it. The song did fairly well, and Vanilla Ice surely got a great deal of success as a result of the song. He had to give Knight a sizable portion of the pie, while everyone was associated. Since Mario Johnson, who was signed to Suge Knight's agency at the time, wrote the song Ice, I signed over the song's earnings to Knight. However, the journey there wasn't without its challenges. During the weeks they spent negotiating, Knight reportedly made several approaches to Ice with his bodyguards, and there was a horrible rumor going about that Knight had broken into his hotel room and hung him by his ankles over the balcony for a while. However, Ice was the one who. In order to allay those fears, Xenon Pictures published a document in 2001 titled Welcome to Death Row, which detailed the record label's ascent and decline while doing research. In an excerpt published from one of the numerous interviews that were done, Vanilla, the production company was able to interview a number of individuals connected to either the label or Knight himself. Ice made it clear that Knight did not hang him from a balcony. He remarked, "He didn't hang me off any balconies." Nevertheless, the narrative has been exaggerated, and I would like to make it clear that Suge and I do not harbor animosity toward one another. Knight had dragged Ice out onto the balcony to discuss the royalty situation, and despite his intimidation, Knight did not grasp. Violent with the singer, but when you consider it, it's a little odd since many people in the industry were prepared to believe that notion to be true just because of the reputation Suge had developed. Suge, who was on death row for a few years, was making waves on the West Coast in the 1990s. He was able to access the most brilliant members of the beloved NWA for a few things thanks to the DLC. Worked in his advantage at this point because the DLC wanted to leave the NWA and break with their record company. He also wanted to leave the brutal records controlled by EASE in order to terminate his contract. Although it was never formally acknowledged, DLC benefited from Dr. Dre's desire to join Suge at the same time, even if it was never officially confirmed by NWA's manager Jerry. Heller disclosed that Suge used lead pipes to coerce him into releasing Doc and Dr. Dre from their contracts. Nonetheless, the rappers chose to support Suge regardless of the consequences. Prior to discussing Death Row Recordings' explosive growth, I would like to briefly discuss why Dr. Dre left Washington and Ruthless Recordings in the first place. It's due to the fact that Dre will later play a significant part in the crossing of paths between Esh and 50 Cent. Dre initially signed with Ruthless Records in 1987, and in his capacity as head of production, he oversaw a number of projects that were extremely successful, effectively creating a fortune for the label, but Dre had to pay a price for all of that success. He typically spent months overseeing several projects with an endless list of As time went on and he kept hitting the mark, Dre felt that he was being a touch shortchanged by E and mercilessly recorded the idea of possibly leaving the group, and the label was essentially off the table until Ice Cube did just that in 1989. After he opened the door, it couldn't be closed because Suge and the group grew increasingly irritated with Dre's brutal records. Both men claimed to have reviewed the label books with the lawyer and concluded that Hella and E were essentially screwing Dre until DLC intervened to drive him over the brink. Since DLC and Suge were now well-known participants in the game and had more cash, Dre made the decision to leave Inwa behind and start their own record company. Finance the label, but what about Suge? Do you recall how he shook down Vanilla Ice to get royalties? Well, he utilized that money to launch Death Row Records, which he did very swiftly. Having the label manage the music for the 1992 film Deep Cover, the title track, not only gave Dr. Dre more visibility, but also made his protege Snoop Dogg known to the globe. They started working on Dre's first album, The Chronic, which altered the game when it came out. It sold nearly 6 million copies worldwide and went triple platinum. Dre took shots. Snoop Dogg used it as a platform to become a well-known individual when Ruthless Records went after EE's, and it also made the West Coast a formidable power. When Snoop released his debut solo album, Doggy Style, in 1993, it went quadruple platinum and received widespread acclaim, just like The Chronic had. Death Row pushed things to a whole new level. The following few years were fascinating for Sue and Death Row because he started arguing with a few people while the ganga lifestyle was being scrutinized. Was exacerbated by the fact that Snoop Dogg was at the heart of a civil rights activist campaign against him and was accused of first-degree murder around the time Doggy Style was released. Gangster rapper C. Dolores Tucker, 66, targeted Time Warner since one of its divisions was in charge of Death Row Records distribution. Suge was naturally incensed, as did the remainder of the label, so when Tucker asked him about putting out uplifting hip-hop music, it didn't matter that Tucker indicated she could persuade Time Warner to spend $80 million to make it happen. During this time, Scene's rivalry with the East Coast intensified to the point where he needed bodyguards after being killed. While all of this fighting was ongoing and Death Row was becoming more and more well-known, Suge targeted Tupac, the biggest fish of them all, with threats from criminals connected to Suge Knight. According to the story, Tupac and his wife contacted Suge and Lau while Shaker was incarcerated in 1995 because his mother was about to lose her home. Suge and Lau promptly paid Tupac's mother $155,000. A few months later, Shake went to see Tupac in jail and paid $1 to post his bail. $4 million, most likely as a result of his signing with Death Row Records after he was released, which is precisely what Tupac did. He had a great run with Death Row while the East Coast versus West Coast conflict intensified, but I won't go into that. Information about that here, since Dr. Dre's actions were what really affected the Suge and 50 feud. Dre wasn't the biggest fan of the path that Throw was going in, but they had a tremendous success together. But the reputation of the Death Row record was far from ideal due to Scene's incapacity to withstand conflict and the growing battle between the coasts. Since Suge was getting out of hand, Dre thought it might be better for them to have some distance. As a result, Suge was arrested for breaking his parole and sent to. Around that period, in 1996, Dre created his own record label, Aftermath Entertainment, which was a division of Interscope, just like Death Row had. At this moment, there was a lot of excitement since Dre had not only made himself an enemy of the night, but Tupac had also turned against him in light of everything that could have happened recently. About Tupac's first collaboration with Death Row Records, but the rapper soon realized that it was a bad idea to deal with Suge Knight because he didn't earn nearly enough when. It had been claimed that Tupac left death prison, but he was stalled for two reasons. First, he owed a lot of money to Suge, who brought in a lot of money for the label and Knight. Second, There was a perception that Tupac was drawn to the life of a gangster and that he could stay closest to it by staying aligned. He helped his mother keep her house and was the one who released him from jail on bond. Additionally, he was very devoted to Suge, so when it came time to turn on Dor and defend Suge, he did just that. Eminem and 50 Aftermath Entertainment weren't interested in releasing song after song, but instead positioned itself as a boutique company that prioritized quality over quantity in light of Dre's issues with Brutal Records and the Road Tour to a lesser degree. This made perfect sense, but things did not get off to the ideal start. In November 1996, Dr. Dre unveils the Aftermath, marking his departure from gangster rap, and the Recording Industry Association of America, or the RIAA, declared the album platinum for his participation in the Coast Wars. Although it did not become particularly well-liked by fans, in widespread concerns that the label might be running out of stock arose as a result of the long-term involvement with a few stinkers in the following years and their failure to leave much of an effect. After several commercial failures, the label's fortunes started to turn around in 1998. Jimmy Iovine, who co-founded Interscope, was close friends with Dr. Dre and recommended the music producer to look at a new talent named Marshall Mathers, better known as Eminem. Dre saw right away that M was unique, so we signed him and started recording an album. Dre took a very hands-on part in producing 3 of the tracks and contributing his vocals to 2 of them. The Slim Shady LP, which will be Eminem's debut LP, was highly contentious, and M became a huge success almost immediately, and the LP was the first significant hit that Dre had released. However, Dre also released his album 2001, which went on to. The album, which went 6 times platinum, signaled Dre's comeback to the forum and demonstrated his continued dominance at the same time. His notoriety soared, and the label's early setbacks swiftly became a thing of the past, even if Dre was involved in other litigation in the years that followed. Everything was going well, but in 2002, with the entrance of 50, in an attempt to lure 50 to the label, Eminem flew him to Los Angeles to meet Dr. Dre. Dre recognized 50's ability and signed him to a $1 contract, just like he had done with Eminem. Million agreement, and began working on his debut album, Get Rich or Die Trying, which was released by the label in February 2003 and was dubbed the most anticipated rap artist's debut album in about around this period. Knight and 50 Cent first crossed paths, and the album became a huge hit, selling about 900,000 copies in its first week and going 9 times platinum in 2020. The co-founder of Death Row soon discovered that 50 Cent would not be frightened. Between Tupac's passing and Knight's incarceration from 1996 to 2001, Death Row Records was having a lot of trouble, and during his absence, Dr. Dre and Aftermath Entertainment became his main rivals. In 2002, 50 Cent was the most popular name in hip-hop, and Suge knew he had to meet this man in person. The atmosphere shifted when it was revealed that Suge Knight had arrived on the set of 50 Cent's highly successful music video for In the Club. Although Knight had always been a formidable character, things had gotten far worse in recent years. Several reports claimed that Knight was responsible for both Tupac's passing and Biggie's as well. Well, it was generally assumed that Knight planned Biggie's song to vent his frustration, but this was never verified. Nevertheless, when you combine all of that with his already established notoriety, indicated that almost nobody wanted to see Suge Knight appear, especially when D12's Bizarre showed there to see the encounter between 50C and Suge Knight, the co-founder of Death Row. The young star's entourage practically vanished as he pulled up with about 30 guys in tow and marched straight up the 50, despite there were rumors that Eminem wanted to enter and make sure his. Although his pal was safe, he shouldn't have been concerned because 50 Cent was unconcerned. He asked him what he wanted tonight while wearing his goons, and Suge did nothing but take a breath of his cigar and went. It was obviously intended to scare 50 people, but it didn't seem to work. To this day, Nobody is entirely sure why Suge was at that set. However, it has been claimed that he was somewhat concerned about Dr. After just one encounter, Dre realized that 50 Cent could not possibly care less about him, no matter how hard he tried. After Suge departed, 50 just returned to creating. One of the best music videos ever made. 50 Cent had been to hell and back before, and there was something very significant about him that Suge Knight didn't get when he met him. I'll talk about working with Eminem and Dr. Dre in a moment, but first you should be aware that when 50 Cent signed with Aftermath, everything about their behavior was. The crew realized that with 50 Cent on the roster, they were living in hazardous times where anything could happen, so they transformed themselves. Everyone on the crew wore a bulletproof vest, and they drove bulletproof cars. 50 Cent, whose real name is Curtis Jackson, had a challenging upbringing. His mother was a drug dealer and passed away when he was just 8 years old. This made 50 Cent similar to many of his classmates. Jackson was raised by his grandparents after her death. He claimed that if he wasn't in school, he was most likely selling crack or going to the gym. Yes, Jackson was a preteen. As he grew older, Jackson didn't really veer from his life as a drug dealer who frequently brought his product to school with a few firearms. He was caught a week before his 19th birthday for distributing cocaine to someone who later turned out to be an undercover police officer, but he was fortunate to escape going to jail because he might have easily been imprisoned for at least 3 or 6 years. Instead, he spent 6 months at a boot camp where he obtained his GED. At that point, Jackson decided it was time to change his ways before it was too late, and he took the moniker 50 Cent, which he interpreted as a symbol of transformation, was first given to Jackson by a buddy in 1996. Run DMC's Jam Master Jay spotted Jackson's desire to pursue a career in music and instructed him on. I won't go into too much detail regarding Jackson's early work, but his 50 Cent was directing attention to all the fundamentals of crafting hooks, choruses, and song structure. After releasing the highly contentious yet humorous How to Rob song, he caught the attention of Jay-Z, DMX, and the Wu-Tang Clan, and he was even invited to go on tour with Nas for Nostradamus, but tragedy occurred at the same time when 50 Cent was shot 9 times at close range, leaving him dead. The bullets went through his hand, both legs, chest, and hip. His left cheek, but amazingly, he lived and recovered completely in roughly 5 months. Darryl Bong, Mike Tyson's bodyguard and close friend, had delivered the blow, but the heavyweight. It has been claimed that Kenneth McGriff, known as a crack kingpin, was responsible for the hit and sought revenge after 50 Cent, even though Boxer had nothing to do with the actual shooting. Revealed details of his criminal history in the song. After overcoming a challenging upbringing and defeating death at its own game, 50 Cent developed into a guy who could not be intimidated. According to legends, this wasn't the only time Suge and 50 Cent met. Knight, with his reputation as a gangster and hordes of guys, could do anything to half Cent, even break a sweat. Apparently, 50 was alone when he pulled up with a group of guys who had burners, but he refused to be frightened and simply reclined back in his car and whirled around with an Uzi to protect himself. Knight retreated once more, and his encounters with 50 Cent were indicative of a far larger issue. His credibility and reputation were quickly eroding. Suge merely spent several years on the streets before ending up behind bars again in 2003. He kept things under control while incarcerated, but his ultimate goal wasn't to obtain death row records. Instead, he started smear campaigns against all the artists he was at odds with, including Snoop Dogg. He even succeeded in severing his connections with unscrupulous people who had given Suge more opportunities than he had. Arguably merited, Suge spent time in and out of jail supporting up-and-coming musicians and igniting feuds, but if I go back in time, he failed to release a single record throughout this period. Death Row Records didn't really do much to find new artists after Tupac died, although they gained a lot of money by releasing 2 of his albums after his death, and Death Row Records was essentially doing nothing and they wasted a lot of time remixing and remixing Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg's songs from their time with the label. To find or create new stars, Death Row records Suge Knight's financial problems were exacerbated each time he was imprisoned, and it was undeniable that his behavior became increasingly unpredictable. Increasingly erratic following his terrible encounters with 50 Cent, matters worsened in 2006 when Suge Knight and Death Row Records both declared bankruptcy. By that time, Suge had spent over of his incarceration. Death Row lacked well-known figures and significant releases, and nearly no one in the business desired to be connected to Knight's Suge. He owed his creditors around. The IRS, Interscope Records, and other musicians who had previously been signed to the Death Row label were among his $120 million list of creditors when he filed for bankruptcy 11. Records was dead rattled and kept getting into trouble for the following few years, but in January of 2015, he smashed his car into his friend, which was the tipping point. Terry Carter claimed to have acted in self-defense when he killed and nearly killed filmmaker C. Sloan, but all of the witnesses in the area said he followed the two from the set of. Suge was sentenced to 28 years in prison after purposefully running over both guys while straight out of Compton. He is currently incarcerated at R.J. Donovan. He has little chance of being released from the San Diego Correctional Facility before October 23rd. 50 Cent has had more success throughout the years, but he may never have achieved the heights of Get Rich or Die. Attempting once more, 50 Cent is still well known despite having seen his share of difficulties. He declared bankruptcy a few years ago, but managed to recover rather successfully, even playing at the Super Bowl. Knight was a bully and thug who was able to establish the appropriate relationships and gain authority. He was constantly on the verge of using violence to get what he wanted. This was evident during the Super Bowl halftime show. Everything he desired, which not only increased his reputation, but also made it inevitable that less individuals would want to collaborate with him over time. Eventually, someone would simply refuse to give up. He revealed that someone was none other than 50 Cent, who was fresh to the scene and should have been an easy target, but their encounters signaled Suge's demise. The big man, who had been toying with fire for a long time, came undone, lost his record label, and was not as respected or afraid as his peers. He will now spend there. For the foreseeable future, 50 Cent has remained true to himself and made sure that his name will be remembered much more favorably than she. The two men's brief encounters during the night demonstrated that Suge was aware of 50 Cent's distinct, and his anxieties were validated. He had repeatedly encountered the one man who refused to be deterred by his stick, which is the reason why Knight was. Our video is about being afraid of 50 Cent. Try one of these if you liked it. Boxes as well. I'll see you at the next one.